introduce our panel. Canberra, is it the city we think it is? Is it the city we think it is? How is it changing? And are we less responsive to people in need? Ready to discuss this are the panellists. To my right and your left is Sarah Murdoch, who is the Executive Officer of St John's Care. St John's Care is an outreach service based in Reid at St John's Anglican Church there. It is run in partnership with Anglicare and supported by Anglican parishes across Canberra. St John's Care assists people who struggle with issues of low income, isolation and social disadvantage, and Sarah was previously with Anglicare's Youth and Family Services portfolio. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
Dr. John Falzon is the Chief Executive Officer of St Vincent de Paul Society, the National Council of Australia, with a long-standing interest in advocacy around social justice and a history of action around that. Interested in the analysis of structural causes of inequality across Australia. Welcome, John. And Patrick Percival Power, better known as Pat, is a retired Roman Catholic bishop. Pat is a member of the Australian Social Justice Council and an advocate with a deep interest in the welfare of all people. In 2000, Pat chaired a major inquiry into poverty in the Australian Capital Territory. Welcome to you, Pat. So, again, the premise behind today's seminar is that we are an affluent society. There's an acknowledgement of that, isn't there? That we are wealthy by on many measures compared to the rest of Australia. And yet that affluence, it's argued, masks entrenched disadvantage, financial stress and social isolation. So I want to start with John very quickly because I think we need to test this. He's got a fire in his belly, John Stanhope. He thinks Canberra's wealth is real, but he's increasingly frustrated that not enough is being done to share that wealth. And I guess, you know, have you come to a dim view of the citizenry of the ACT, John, since you've retired as Chief Minister, or have you always been concerned about a smugness or a lack of a capacity to respond compassionately? So could you quickly just give me a sense of that? Because I think we need to test this.
I've lived in Canberra for almost 50 years now, and I love Canberra. I'm a devoted Canberra, and I think we are a wonderful city and a wonderful community. I've always had a passion for fairness and justice. When I look back at my time in politics, the things that I hold most dear are the commitment that I made to issues around justice and a fair society and human rights. So it's always been a deep concern of mine. As I mentioned before, I think I had, as a result, most particularly of my work at Wanganini Aboriginal Health Service, I now spend an awful lot of time with Aboriginal people. Wanganini has 6,500 Aboriginal clients. There are 7,000 Aboriginal people living in Canberra. And I have gotten to know many of these people deeply. And I have come to understand that we middle-class white people simply cannot, even with the best intentions in the world and the deepest empathy and the greatest effort, begin to understand the lives that so many Aboriginal people live. It is simply not, I think, possible for many of us to understand, even to deeply empathise with the nature of the lives of many Aboriginal people within our community and, of course, across Australia. So I advocate actually almost every day of the week on behalf of Wanganini the Aboriginal community, and I am at times shocked at the lack of responsiveness from our government, from individual ministers and from the community broadly. I would use one example, for instance, of just the lack of responsiveness and our middle class white response to deeply disadvantaged Aboriginal people. Without using any names or a particular circumstance, we had a young man that died in tragic circumstances and left a young family behind. Julie Thomas, the CEO of Wanganini, launched a public appeal. You see this all the time, appeals when tragic accidents occur and children are left fatherless or motherless. The appeal raised $800. And I see other appeals where hundreds of thousands are raised. And I raised the question, why did we as a community
So it's deeply felt for you, John, but I guess I want to say that what does a caring society or community or city look like? And cities are complex. I don't want to suggest that we are, you know, having the last word. They are nuanced places. But the typical measures of compassion are volunteering and donating to charity. And with the exception, thanks John, with the exception of that appeal, we get 2 ticks. We do well on the volunteering measure. State by state, the ACT scores best. More people in the ACT as a percentage of people volunteer their time than any other jurisdiction. Tick. And people in the ACT give more to charity, more or less, along with New South Wales, than any other jurisdiction. Tick. So it's there's obviously something else going on. So to tease that out, Sarah Murdoch with St John's Care, you engage with clients on the margins. What's your take of this idea that Canberra, a tale of 2 cities?
I have mixed, when we were talking earlier, I have mixed opinions of this because every day I see a large group of volunteers come to work, give up their time and their energy and greet our clients in such a beautiful fashion and with such grace and support. And so when I was first asked the question, and also having a complete background in community services, I've always seen a city that gives and a city that gives. And then when I was asked this question and I pondered over it, and also hearing what John just said, it's true, and it's often the same people that give. It's the same people that give a lot. Our volunteers are wonderful, and the people that donate to our charities, we're so blessed to have them. But they're often the same people, and they're not necessarily those that can always afford to do as much as what they are. Also, with what was said in regards to the Indigenous family, where that money wasn't raised, that made me question, are we doing a lot of community-based things and raising a lot of money for still white families or still families? Do we need to get out more support, volunteering support, financial support for our Indigenous community within the ACT and raise awareness to that?
You raised the idea that there are a good number of high-income public servants in the city who really have no idea. So there might be a gap there in people's understanding. John Falzon, what do you think of this? I think you suggest that perhaps conceptually it's a way to engage us, but it might not be a useful way to start.
I think for a start, I don't believe Canberra is a tale of 2 cities. I think it's many. And the recent census data seems to be telling that kind of story, that it's multi-layered. The gap between rich and poor, the inequality is multi-layered, quite nuanced, quite subtle in places, quite difficult to see, and therefore masked. Therefore not as much in your face. I mean, for some of us it is very much in our face. We see it, we know it, because we have the privilege of hearing people's stories, as John has put it so eloquently and heartbreakingly. We hear these stories; these are real people, and so we get very angry. However, I would have to say that for me, the real drivers of that inequality and that lack of consciousness of inequality are structural. That we live, and this is not a Canberra, I hate to break it to you folks, but we're not that special. We're special, but we're not that special. Our problem is national and indeed global, because the heart of inequality is embedded in our rotten system. Our neoliberalism has inequality as its core. Some people see a person who is experiencing homelessness and say, the system's broken, it's not working. In fact, the system is working, because that inequality is not accidental. It's absolutely embedded in our system. And so we live in this system. It's not only where we make our home, but it inhabits our souls. Audre Lorde, that wonderful poet and theorist, says, that the battle against oppression, against the oppressor, it isn't just to escape those situations of oppression that we find ourselves in, but to be rid of that piece of the oppressor that is planted deep within each of us. So it's a massive historical struggle, but I see great cause for optimism because people are incensed when explained, when the struggle, when the inequality, when the injustice is explained and people's consciousness is raised. I see a sense of solidarity emerging.
So John, having said that Canberra isn't unusual, tell us what you do see. You regularly go out with the Committee's night patrol. You know, what's the trend? Who's accessing that service and has it changed?
Yeah, it changes. It does change. We're seeing this anecdotally, but also the census data is telling us about the changes, some quite concerning changes, which I'm sure everyone here is aware of. The emergence of, for instance, older women experiencing homelessness. So, you know, again, it goes back to neoliberal capitalism with patriarchy, of course, at its heart, and racism, the toxic fruits of colonisation. Again, we're seeing that manifested in the absolutely unconscionable rates of both homelessness and, of course, incarceration. We saw that report released yesterday of First Nations peoples. So we're seeing that certainly mirrored in Canberra. I mean, it breaks my heart when we see children on the streets. And it just blows your mind. Whether you've got children or not, it just reduces you to tears when you see kids living rough on the streets and exposed to all kinds of vulnerabilities and dangers. So, but the bottom line is this. No matter how much goodwill there is, no matter how much individual compassion there is, we will continue to have this situation, and we'll either feel good about it or not. That's a personal thing. Some people feel good because they're doing something. Other people feel good because they're venting about it. I like nothing better than a good march, a good rally, as we have on the weekend. But feeling good's got nothing to do with the solution. The solution, again, is structural. And until we have a national approach to housing, which, where there is no vision, the people perish, as the proverb says. We've got no national vision on housing, so it's no surprise that we have the rates of homelessness that we do.
Well, let's highlight homelessness in this city. Out this month was the release of the latest ABS census data, showing a decrease in the overall number of homeless people in Canberra, but an increase in the number of rough sleepers. ACOS, the ACT Council of Social Service, stresses the importance of looking at numbers over time. And the ACT actually has a sustained entrenched problem that is on the whole getting worse since the turn of the century. So, mixed picture, but understanding the importance of public housing as a pathway for people leaving crisis services. What's your take, Sarah, on the demolition of public housing in the centre of the city and the development of arguably better housing in the outer suburbs? And I guess a key question, is there growth in public housing in line with population growth? And what is St John's Care seeing?
We're seeing when we lost the bigger flats, I at the time was at Anglican Youth and Family Services, which is a service that is across the road from them, and we support people between the ages of 12 and 25. So when we lost the flats, or when they were knocked down, I'm not saying at all that was necessarily a bad thing, but something that didn't appear to be considered is to almost every one person that was tenanted there or had tenancy, there was 2 to 4 people sleeping on their couch each night, and because they didn't have a tenant. Sorry, I'm bad with the terminology. Because they weren't on the housing list, they were suddenly homeless because those that were on the housing list were naturally rehoused, but then these 2 to 4 people per house had nowhere to go. And at the time, a lot of them were our young people, aged anywhere between 13 and up. And we saw a significant increase with those young people on our door at quite ridiculous hours of the morning and evening with nowhere to go, or they felt they had nowhere to go or nowhere safe to go. A lot of them stayed and squatted in the flats, literally moving from flat to flat as they knocked them down. So we had significant concerns about their safety and what they were exposed to in that time. So So there was a huge concern there. St John's also then saw the same, St John's Care saw the same concern, but also the lack of services. So those that were rehoused in suburb areas of Canberra, which does increase then community support and engagement, which is vital and you know, significantly important. But what it decreases is the access to the services that weren't necessarily, you know, consulted in the process, and therefore we're still offering services in an area where the cohort no longer lived.
Pat, if I can bring you in at this point, you were chair of the only ever formal government inquiry into poverty in the ACT back in 2000. The inquiry was initiated by Kate Carnell. Would you mind reflecting on that inquiry, what you heard at the time, the context?
It was initiated by Kate Carnell, but I must say it was done a joint project with the ACT government and the ACT Council for Social Services, so it was a joint project there. And one of the things that struck me was the effort that was made to right across the community. I remember a number of forums we had at the Bega Flats, as a matter of fact, but right throughout Canberra we had a number of public forums, opportunities for individuals to make comment and you know, the community organisations involved. And I think by and large there was a good spread of consultation and I think a preparedness by the government to act on the...
But what spearheaded it?
What's that?
What spearheaded it?
I think just the sort of things we're talking about now.
Okay.
You know, the haves and the have-nots, and one of the things I think that emerged from it too was the fact that while we all agree that Canberra is a comparatively affluent community, that in a way the people that aren't doing it tough, in some ways it's so much harder for them than it would be if they're in a place like Canberra or Burke or the poorer parts of Sydney and Melbourne, because somehow or other everyone else seems to be getting all right. And the little example was given then of kids going to school and the fact that they're all going off to their school excursions and all the things, and the ones that couldn't afford it, they're in a much more invidious position than if everyone was in a similar position.
What came of the inquiry, Pat?
What's that?
What became of the inquiry?
Well, there was a report that was...
Yes, there are too often reports, but they sit on shelves. What do you understand came of it?
I think to the credit of successive governments, and the man in front of us would be an important part of it, but even before John's time, the Liberal government and the succeeding Labor government. So I think there are important recommendations made that I think were taken up and implemented. But I wouldn't say that means the whole thing's been a failure. But I think there are new issues that arise all the time, and I think that's what needs to be confronted. That we can't just be satisfied with what.
Do you reckon it's time for another inquiry of its nature?
I've thought about this. My answer to that emphatically is yes, but with a note of caution. I think sometimes the expectations that come out that somehow an inquiry is going to be some sort of a silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems. And the other part of the caution is the fact that it's not just a government responsibility. I think that everyone in the community's got their part to play, and what Sarah's people are doing are a magnificent example of it. But I just think to try and raise the consciousness among individuals in a community is important. I mean, you see, Charlotte, I think, I don't know how things are going now, but the Charlie Army or whatever, and places like that, I think a lot can be done by community groups.
Well, I wonder your view as a long-time Catholic priest and a leader in that space. Is there something going on that, because we're pretty good at putting on services, it strikes me. I'm hearing that from you, Sarah, and perhaps we're good at outsourcing care. And we've seen a growth over time in the Anglicares and the Uniting Cares and the like. where parishes perhaps had once much more of a grassroots role in engaging individuals, families, wrapping themselves around them, and perhaps we think, oh well, it is governments, it is the agencies, and we disempower ourselves really and our own agency to connect and make a difference.
In terms of the parishes too, I'm just talking from a Catholic point of view now, they can be very much a mixed bag. You know, I think a lot of them it's hip hip for Jesus sort of thing, but really, how many of them ask, well, you know, what does Jesus have to say about the poorest of the people? You know, the people that I'm really touched by are the large community that look after disabled people, not in a patronising way, but empowering them to have that sense of dignity. And I'm full of admiration for Alcoholics Anonymous. Every now and then I go along to a meeting, and just to see the way in which, you know, their own sense of powerlessness, and yet there's a real power in that, because they've got that understanding of what the struggles of others are, and the quiet support that they give to one another, I think is so significant.
So if there's a headline from today, it is that there's a call for another inquiry or a fresh inquiry into poverty in the ACT. I don't know if there are any journos in the room, but if there are, I think that's a really important message to receive. John Falzon, would you agree that perhaps, you know, we rely on the St Vinny's Night Patrol and the like, and perhaps we forget what we can do as individuals. And I think, obviously, you feel strongly that entrenched inequality is theft. You feel very passionate that the concentration of wealth in the hands of some is theft. And you're aware of the national picture. So I wonder what is perhaps unique to Canberra, wanting to highlight that we are special. and that perhaps there is something we could do, that it isn't too late, really, to grab this before the city gets bigger and these things become more intractable.
So individually, what we can do is raise our own awareness and share that awareness to raise other people's awareness. The most powerful way to do this is by listening to and creating the spaces for the voices of those who experience injustice. So, you know, all of us here on this platform, we can only tell it secondhand at best. Our real teachers are those who experience the injustice, the inequality. And, you know, an inquiry will be only as good as the degree to which it creates a space for those voices to be heard firsthand. There's nothing more powerful than people telling their own stories and explaining, analysing what has happened and what needs to change. But to me, the most powerful force for change is never individual, it is collective. If you look at the history of social change in Australia, I cannot think of one example where social reform, progressive social change has occurred without it being the people collectively, sometimes taking to the streets, sometimes by other means, under the guiding stars of struggle and hope. Industrial relations reform, tenancy rights, women's rights, environmental rights, First Nations rights. I cannot think of a single area that has not, that the struggle has not been won. It might have been, policies might have been formulated from above and legislation implemented from above, but the agitation and analysis for social change has always got to come from below.
Can I test you on the efficacy of the collective? Because it strikes me that at the federal level, where you're most engaged, there's been talk for a long time about the elephant in the room, which is a new start. So we can come to the important area of income inequality. We talked about homelessness briefly, but we want to move to that area. And yet, despite all of the efforts of so many advocates for so long, and ACOS at the federal level, we saw the federal parliament pass this week laws that, you know, make it tougher to get New Start. So if you apply and it takes Centrelink 6 months to get it through, you're not paid retrospectively. You're not compensated. So, you know, what does it say about the ability to today advocate for change, that really does reduce the gap.
Sorry, Pat, you want to say something first?
Just to come back to that fundamental question, do we need another inquiry? I hope I'm not getting off the point here, Toni, but I just think that the two royal commissions that have one still in progress on banking and the one that's just concluded on the institutional child abuse. And I've got to say, the Catholic Church has emerged as being the biggest culprit in all of that. And I'd have to say, leading up to it, I questioned the need for a royal commission, as I did with the banking one too. But what it does, it gives people I knew we had problems in the Catholic Church in that regard. I listened to a fair bit of it. But I had no idea of the extent of it. And I had no idea of I did have some idea of the fundamental causes that are at the root of it all. And I think the same thing's emerging from the banking inquiry as well. It's when those voices are able to be heard that we can then get to some of them, and then get to some of the admissions which we've had from our own church leaders and from the people in the banks as to what's...
Sure, those stories are key. They put a human face on abuse or deprivation in the case of a poverty inquiry and so on. But my fundamental question is about the efficacy of advocacy today and a disconnect between parliaments and people, and the evidence continually being presented, and yet a sense that it doesn't matter. Another report will produce evidence, but evidence is often not heard. So perhaps we can weave it into the next set of questions around the other issue I want to isolate today, and that is education and the interrelated issue of high incarceration rates. So Sarah, you feel passionate about this. I'll come back to you, John. What are the facts in the ACT about high incarceration rates, and how do the two issues of education and news interact?
So what led this conversation between us was when I was a case manager, I used to go and do a lot of work in Bimberi. And the first time I went in and we were doing just a basic activity with the young people, I was really shocked, and I probably shouldn't have been, but I was very shocked that a number of the young people there needed assistance in writing their name. And I was quite young at the time and very taken by this, and it made me stop, and Anglica and I had a great look into our schools and whatnot, and naturally what unfolded was a lot of these young people have parents with mental health or AOD issues, and they're not getting to school from a young age. They'll leave school by usually the year 4 level, and there's not that education that's being given to them. And obviously education is key if we want to change our youth, if we want to make our youth the next drive for all of us. They have to be well educated. And then also the financial burn that as a community that we have to pick up for young people being incarcerated, and then naturally they don't often go on to make good decisions or give back to the community. Some do, but obviously the stats would suggest otherwise. So, and whenever you hear this conversation raised, often I find in the media, it's then pushed to the schools. Why aren't our teachers doing more? Why aren't our schools doing more? Why aren't we as a community? We've all seen those families that are struggling and thought, oh, maybe someone else will help. Hopefully there's service engagement. Hopefully they're linked to... Yes, hopefully they're linked to the people that can help them. Yeah. But we all can.
So we talked about this earlier, and I wanted to say that I was at a Grattan Institute forum on so-called Gonski 2.0, and that's a curious little name because, there's a lot of politics associated with that. It suggests reform. And a panelist noted at that discussion that in the ACT, we have such a small and nimble number of citizens that in each primary school, we would all know the kids most at risk. We would all know the families for whom life is really tough. And so there's no reason, the panellist was stressing, why the school, the families, the directorate, all arms of government can't provide wraparound services to ensure that child doesn't fall through the cracks. And yet you're saying there are kids in their teens who are struggling to write their name. So we're able to identify them at the school gate. You know, there is no excuse. And the teacher and parent community, as you know, is one of the greatest assets a neighbourhood can have. So what's going on? I mean, to elaborate, Sarah, what is your sense of why the systems, plural, noting that systems are driven and delivered by people, why are these systems not capturing the families at the point we need to capture them early on, so that all boats rise with the tide?
I think all the systems are trying their hardest, like lack of funding, and that's also including CSD with care and protection. We've got a huge number of reports each year to care and protection, and obviously only so many workers that can respond. And then naturally, it's a really significant concerns of neglect and everything that get addressed. But the early intervention is then being missed, and the early intervention should be our community services. That's why we're here, is to do the early intervention. But unfortunately, those names and those families are not getting to us until it's actual crisis point. And I think that's a lot of people in our community. We don't want to necessarily ask that family, are you going okay, when we can see they're not, until it's at a point where you've got to ask the question, or you've got to call a mandated system in to question what's happening there. I think a lot of us put our head down and walk by because we just hope that someone else is picking it up, or don't want to have that hard conversation because we don't necessarily want to hear the answer.
Did you want to reflect on that, John?
I'd actually like to answer your earlier question, which I didn't answer because you posed a really big one, and you basically said those of us who've been advocating for an increase to New Start have failed, and you're absolutely right. And we see the failure mirrored every time you go to the Magis Court and you see someone standing there for the magistrate for stealing a box of spaghetti to feed their kids. That's our failure. That's our failure to win this battle so far, and it has been a failure, absolutely right. Having said that, we haven't seen an increase in the single New Start allowance in real terms since 1994. So this is a failure of both sides of politics. Successive governments have presided over a refusal to increase New Start in real terms. However, I believe there was a real turning point, and that was in 2014. We saw a budget that was unrivalled in its viciousness towards young unemployed people and many others. It was so vicious it made an art form out of cruelty to the unemployed. It was so vicious that it had the obverse effect, and that is to bring people together, to join people together in a sense of shared outrage. So you had aged pensioners and people with a disability and sole parents and young unemployed and everyone else who felt a sense of injustice united in saying this is not okay. Now, what is the solution? I believe that the solution actually comes from an externality, and that is the changing nature of the labour market. That dividing line between in work and out of work, that's gone west. That's no longer a thing. So the struggle of the collective union movement to increase the minimum wage, the fight to protect penalty rates, the fight that Sally McManus has just announced regarding insecure and casualised work, is really of a piece with the struggle for those who are trying to get by from day to day below the poverty line on an inadequate New Start allowance. And so I know I'm called a fool, but I'm not a pessimist, absolutely. And I know that, what Gramsci said about, if you bang your head against the wall, it's your head that breaks, not the wall. I've got a very sore head. But we have an obligation to break that wall. And at the moment, the services, the charity, the wonderful individuals, goodwill, we're chipping away, we're helping people over the wall. But our job is to chip away and tear the bloody thing down. Because as long as we build walls that lock people up or lock them out, we are going to continue with this rising inequality.
Well, I wonder if you can paint us a picture of what that looks like. So, as you say, the ACT is campaigning on this. We've seen insecurity in the labour market deepen with the casualisation of work. And for some time we've heard that some sectors have been ignoring the minimum wage or award wage as the norm, and that's resulting in pushing people further to the fringe. So the clientele you engage, you know, are they at all in meaningful work and yet still struggling? No, just tell us stories that really thicken our understanding.
I'll tell you what a story, I'll tell you a story, and yes, the answer is we are seeing a growing cohort of the so-called working poor as per the American path, and it's disgraceful. There's no place for that in a country that supposedly prides itself on some kind of egalitarian ideal. But here's the story. I get lost all the time up at Parliament House because I'm directionally challenged on one occasion, and people are very nice despite the prejudice against the political class. People are very helpful there. On one occasion I'm standing in front of a lift and looking lost, and a security bloke standing next to me says, "What are you looking for, mate?" And I told him the room number, and he goes, "Oh, I'll take you there." And people do that because they know if they just give me directions, I'll just get lost again. So he took me there. On the way he says to me, "So where are you from?" He looks at my security pass and he goes, "St Vincent." He goes, "You from Vinnie's, mate?" I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Come here, let me give you a hug." I said, "That's very nice of you, mate." He said, "I want to say thank you for everything you've done for me." I said, "I haven't done anything for you, mate. You're the one that's helping me, you know." And then he said, "Can I tell you my story?" So he told me his story. This is one of the people in low-paid, insecure work, a security person in our Parliament House. He says, "Oh, look, I was unemployed for many years, living in Nowra." He said, "I'm starting to get my life together now. It's not much, but it's a step, you know." And he said, Centrelink sent me to a job interview in Wollongong. He said, "I caught the train, went to the job interview, no problems. Left there and looked in my wallet. I didn't have 2 bob to rub together. And I thought, who am I going to turn to? Where am I going to go in my hour of need? Who can help me?" He said, you said you're from Vinnie's, didn't you?" He said, I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh, actually it was the Salvos." He said, "You don't mind though, do you?" And I said, "Yeah, I do actually. I don't want to hear good news stories about that." He said, "That's a joke, right?" I said, "Yeah, that's a joke." Anyway, he took me to the place, and a couple of weeks later I ran into the National Secretary of the Salvation Army, and I said, "Oh, look, Kelvin, I've got a story for you. You're not going to be able to top because there is a bit of rivalry there, you know, hats and everything, you know." And I told him the story, and he said, "I can top that actually, John." He said, "Since you had that encounter," he said, "I ran into the same bloke." He said, "But on this occasion, the difference is he pulled out of his pocket an envelope with $20 in it, and he said, 'Could you give this to the Salvos who helped me in Wollongong?'" Now, this story breaks my heart because people like him are vilified and demonised on the front pages of the tabloid press and on your current affairs shows as the leaners, as the bludgers, as the loafers, who the rest of us virtuous people who pay taxes supposedly, you know, in fact everyone pays taxes, we support them out of our largesse. You know, how offensive, how offensive. And they're told, best case scenario, that if they wait long enough, the wealth will trickle down. Another big lie. But did he wait? Once he had a little bit in his pocket, he didn't wait. And what he gave was a huge chunk of dough. And that wasn't charity, that was solidarity. As I said, change comes from below, from the people, and that's why I'm inspired.
Yeah, lovely stories. In fact, I'm reminded, I went to see for the first time in my life Jesus Christ Superstar the other night. It was so good. Local production, it was excellent. And I'm reminded of Mary Magdalene, you know, pouring the oil and perfume on Jesus' feet. You know, people are very generous at the bottom. And perhaps there's something to be said about leadership that's mean-spirited, that has an effect on people who can give more, who think that their incomes are shrinking or that they're under pressure, and perhaps we're less generous as a people. And I think you were suggesting that people aren't giving as much to St John's Care. Is that right?
Yes, so if I looked at the statistics just in the last week, and if you look at the last year, our donation levels have decreased, and I do also think that has to do with the working poor as well, because it's a lot of our working poor that give a lot to us. So I think it's a sign that there's more people in our community that are struggling and can't give as much. But then also we've had a significant increase of those that need support and that need financial assistance and that aren't getting by. And especially with the conversations on New Start, the fact that also New Start doesn't take into consideration a family. You know, we had a woman just 2 days ago come into the centre who had 4 children at home and was on New Start, had lost her job suddenly, about a month ago, couldn't make ends meet, and was significantly challenging to feed her 4 children, 3 of which were growing teenage boys, and if for the parents in the room, yes, exactly, and for everyone, and males in the room, I'm sorry, but you boys can put away quite a lot. And she had started to break down to one of our volunteers, and she just said, there's no food in the house, the kids have eaten it all, and they've got to come first. And she could not make her ends meet on New Start, and she will not be able to. We will see her until she gets employment, and she's applying for everything. She's doing the hardest job she can. And she's very positive and she's very hopeful. But we will see her again in our service and until her situation looks different, and she'll be reaching out to other services naturally.
Perhaps we should change the name New Start, because it's anything
No
but, clearly. From both of you, would you expect the Barr government to be doing more to lobby its federal counterpart, at least on New Start, and a vision around homelessness? Do you think there's any room for perhaps, I think you have a dim view, don't you, John, on concessions and state-based concessions to compensate for a low federal income option?
I don't have a dim view of state-based concessions. What I have a dim view of is the notion that it should be the responsibility of state and territory jurisdictions to make up for the abrogation of federal responsibility in this area. And so, yes, I'm all in favour of our jurisdiction doing everything it can through the levers that are available to make life as good as possible for the people who are struggling below the poverty line or hovering around it. And for, where appropriate in the co-ed process, for example, for state and territory leaders to really give voice to the fundamental injustice that lies at the heart of our labour market and our social security system, the way people are demonised for using it. However, I would be completely against the idea of increasing inequality between jurisdictions by saying, well, here in the ACT, we'll give you the gold standard. We'll top up the unemployment benefit so that we're going to make up for what the feds are failing to do. I think we have to make sure as a nation that we address this fundamental inequality.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. It's 20 past, and we want to allow some questions from the floor. I sort of was keen to explore, and it's a conversation perhaps for another time, the idea of social capital, and I guess, does inequality fundamentally weaken social cohesion? What's perhaps going on in our city if we see medium and high density apartments that are increasingly marketed as glamorous and close to the centre, that pushes people out and makes the centre a very attractive but inaccessible place for the poor. And I've seen just in the 10 years I've lived in this city a real fundamental change in the nature of the dynamics of the city and who interacts with who. And so it's a bigger question, or series of questions, I guess, about neighbourliness. I've always thought that we're good at that here, and is that under threat as inequality deepens?